Hey guys, and welcome back for another video. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about keybinds. Not just because it's a pretty crucial part of how you play this game as well as any game, but every single time I play this game with someone who's unfamiliar with the genre or with PC gaming in general, they tend to struggle with the controls for Guild Wars 2. Now everyone's going to have different ideal keybinds based on the size of their hand and what they have to actually play the game with, whether it's a mouse with a couple extra buttons on the side or if you have a dedicated gamepad. This guide is going to be mostly just for keyboard with a standard mouse, which I think is how most people are probably going to be playing Guild Wars 2. My goal with these keybinds is to keep as much of what you do on the keyboard and at the same time keep everything as close together as possible so that you're not overreaching for certain keys, decreasing the chance that you might miss a key and mess up whatever it is you were trying to do. I will be providing a keyboard layout to kind of help explain why I made some of the decisions that I did. And with that, guys, let's go ahead and get in game so I can show you how this all comes together. Alright guys, so now we're in game. Go ahead and press escape so that we can access the options. On the options pane, look at the left side, bottom tab should say control options, and that's going to be all the keybinds. I'm going to default mine real quick just to make sure that we're looking at the same thing, and I'll bring in that keyboard layout I mentioned earlier. But we're gonna go ahead and take away the entire right-hand side of the keyboard because these binds are focused on the left-hand side. Now, in nearly every PC game out there, the default movement controls are gonna be WAS and D. For this particular set of binds, we're actually just going to scooch that over one on the keyboard, so it'll be E, S, D, and F. The reason I do this is because with WASD, most of the rest of the keyboard is all on the right-hand side, and by just moving these over by one key, we free up some keys on the left and right-hand side of our hand. Moving down from that, we get into the skills section, and I'm actually gonna skip swap weapons for just a second, but we'll talk about it before the video's over. For your weapon skill 1, we're actually just going to unbind that, and again, we'll talk about that in a second. And for your weapon and utility skills, we're essentially just going to use the two keys in the same row as E on either side of E. So one weapon skill will be Q, then W, then R, then T. I'm not going to tell you which order to put these in because I think it sort of depends on the class you're playing or maybe just your playstyle. Obviously, you want things that are going to come off of cooldown faster, closer to your hand, and maybe put some of the ones that are on longer cooldowns further away. But for the sake of this guide, weapon skill 2 will be Q, 3 will be W, 4 will be R, and 5 will be T. For the heal skill, we're actually just going to use the A key as it's right next to the strafe left key if you've been following along. And for the elite skill as well as the utility skills, this is where it gets a little weird depending on how familiar you are with PC controls. Do keep in mind that the idea here is that we're trying to keep as many functions as possible on the keyboard, so we may have to use some modifiers to get the most out of that. And for these, I tend to use Shift. When my hand is in the ESDF position, my pinky falls directly on the Shift key, and it just makes for an easy modifier in my opinion. Now, I know that not everybody likes using modifier keys, and again, we'll talk about that once we get through the core of this keybind. But for your utility skills, I typically just add a Shift modifier to the weapon abilities. So, in other words, we'll use Shift W, Shift R, Shift T, and for the elite skill, I use Shift A. I tend to just add the modifier key to abilities that have longer cooldowns, and your elite skill is definitely one of those. That also puts your heal and elite skill on the same key, so if you're afraid you might bump that, feel free to move it somewhere else. The profession skills by default are set to all of your F keys, but those are a little farther away than I'd like them to be, and since we've already moved all the abilities off the number keys, I tend to just assign the profession abilities 1 through 5 to keys 1 through 5. Down from that, we have the special action hotkey, but we're actually going to skip that one again for now and move all the way down to user interface. Now, based on this keybind, we actually haven't changed any of these yet or overwritten them with other commands, but we have freed up all those F keys, and just as a convenience, I like to use my F keys for all of my user interface. I typically do them left to right, the same way that they're laid out in the top left-hand side of the screen, and that's just so I have a reference to easily remember which one of those F keys it actually was that I bound it to. These binds are entirely up to you. This is just a convenience that I happen to enjoy, so I thought I'd share with you guys. From there, we need to scroll all the way down to Miscellaneous, and all we need to set here is the Interact key. By default, this is F, as I'm sure you're more than familiar with if you've been playing on default controls, but we're actually just going to change that to G, so it's in the same position that it was from WASD, now with ESDF. Now we still have a few binds ahead of us. I've obviously skipped over some things, and that's because there's a little bit of customization that is really going to depend on where you would like to put some of these things based on how often you use them. Not to mention, I have no problem with shift modifiers, but I know a lot of people out there kind of cringe when they hear that being used. But because it's such a natural hand position that the pinky kind of just lands on the shift, I'm hoping that it'll be a little bit easier for some of you guys out there who are maybe a little skeptical about using modifiers. All that being said, I will tell you now what I would like to use for the remaining binds. Just keep in mind that these can be anything, as any of these keys can obviously be anything, so don't take the remainder of this too much to heart, as you do still have some customization ahead of you if you don't like what I've chosen. All the way back up at the top, I said earlier that V would be fine, and hopefully you can see why now, as your hand in the default position, the F key is directly above the V key, allowing you easy access to your dodge. Just down from that, you have skills. We skipped over weapon swap, and I typically use Shift Q for this. By moving the hand position over even just one key, we're now much farther away from the tilde key, which is the default weapon swap key. Down from that, we never set anything for the weapon skill 1, and that's because by default, weapon skill 1 is your auto attack. By right-clicking or double right-clicking on an enemy, you're automatically going to start that auto attack chain that will persist through all of your other skills until the enemy's been defeated. Down from that, we skipped over the special action hotkey. This key doesn't come up all the time depending on what content you're playing. Because of this, I definitely wanted to have access to the key when I needed it, but I wanted it to be buried again behind a shift modifier. This time, I chose to go with Shift Mouse Wheel 3. Now, I said this guide was for a standard mouse, and I know not all mice have the scroll wheel, but I feel like most of them do, and purchasing a standard mouse with a scroll wheel is not super expensive. So I hope nobody feels left out if you're one of the few who still don't have that scroll wheel. Down from that, we have targeting, and we skipped over this because it sort of depends on individual player preference. Some people may still be able to reach the tab key from here to cycle between targets, but that's not always going to be the case, like in my case. As always, use whatever you think is going to be best for you, but I've actually bound this to C because it's right below the backup key and it's very easy to hit. In other more challenging content, such as fractals, dungeons, raids, that type of thing, you're going to see people calling targets, and you're going to want to be able to take those targets as well as call your own as you learn the fights. What I went ahead and set up here was Z to take target, and Shift Z to call target. Z isn't necessarily the easiest thing to hit, but I think that in practice it could be easier to hit than some of the other remaining keys that we haven't already bound to something. Again, and I know I'm saying this a lot, feel free to set these to whatever you want. The idea here is really just to have a good base of binds that you can then sort of decide for yourself what is most convenient based on the way you play the game. And that, guys, is basically the gist of this bind setup, but I do want to make mention of a few things real quick. Firstly, if you hold down the left and right mouse button at the same time, you'll actually move forward. And if you move the mouse side to side with those pressed in, the camera will turn too. I only mention this because I do know a few MMO players who prefer this mode of moving, and it does free up WASD, or in our case, ESD and F, to be other commands altogether, and that could turn this entire bind on its head if it's something you can get used to. Personally, I never could get used to moving this way, so I always have my movement keys. Also, we did go ahead and set a bind for the back up key, but that key really isn't used all that often unless you're doing a jumping puzzle and you're trying to get better footing before making a jump. You don't have to set anything to the backup key, but I would definitely make sure that you at least have a backup key somewhere for the off chance that you find yourself in a jumping puzzle or a situation where you might have to reposition. And lastly, I do know that mounts exist in this game. I do know that you can set an individual bind for every mount that you have. And while all that's great, I personally use the mount hot swap tool. I actually made a guide on that a little while back if you want to check that out. But because of this, I can put all of my mounts on just one key. And what I typically do, or at least in the case of this setup, would just be to use H 1 over from G to make that nice and easy, but still out of the way so that I don't bump it. I know not everybody's going to want to use that mount add-on, and for those people out there, I just recommend picking a bind that you feel most comfortable with, whether that's some number keys on your numpad or some other keys on the keyboard that you can easily access. But with a setup like this, you probably want all your mounts on one key just to, again, keep it all centrally located so that you don't have to relocate your hands after swapping mounts. But anyway, guys, that's the gist of this guide. I hope this helps somebody out there maybe trying to find an alternative to the default Guild Wars 2 controls. I'm hoping that a few friends of mine might even watch this and get some ideas on how they can make the game a little bit more playable until they figure out how PC controls work. These binds are actually the binds I used to use, well, for the most part, before I got a mouse with some buttons on the side, and so I've sort of switched it up, but I gotta be honest, after playing around with these old binds again, I might be switching back. Something about this just feels a little bit better than mashing these tiny buttons on the side of my mouse. That being said, I do think there are advantages to having buttons on the side of your mouse, or maybe even a few extra on your keyboard. So if you're still struggling after trying out a couple of binds, that might not be a bad idea. But anyway, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.